Elara was a widow. That was her only true title in the town of Prospect Creek. Her husband, Elias, had been the town's quiet eccentric, a man whose hands were always stained with soil and whose eyes were always on the horizon. He had died 2 years prior, leaving Elara with 3 things of value: a small, stony plot of land just beyond the town's edge, a stoic old horse named Granite, and a heavy, leather-bound trunk. Inside the trunk were the journals. They were not diaries of emotion, but ledgers of the earth. Decades of observations, penned in the careful script of Elias's father and his father before him. They chronicled the migration of birds, the depth of the frost line, the thickness of squirrel coats, the dates of the first and last snow. And they spoke of the cycle, a pattern recurring every 70 to 80 years, a winter of profound and lethal severity. The last one, the journal for 1824, noted, had left only 3 families alive in the entire valley. The entry was stark. The sky turned to iron. The snow was not water, but dust. It buried the proud houses first. Elara had read the words until they were branded onto her memory. She had cross-referenced the signs, the early departure of the summer birds, the unusual abundance of pine nuts the previous fall, the strange, deep silence that had begun to settle in the forests. The cycle was coming. Her plan was not born of panic, but of the cold, hard logic written in faded ink. She would not build a house to stand against the snow. She would build a house for the snow to bury. An earth shelter. A winterstead dug into the northern face of the hill on her property. It would be a cellar of impossible scale, a home beneath the ground, warmed by the deep, constant temperature of the planet itself. It was the only way. In early May of 1903, she walked into town. Her dress was simple, her face unadorned. She went to the office of Mayor Thompson, a man whose considerable girth was a testament to the town's prosperity. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for help. She asked only for an acknowledgement of the blasting permit she had filed. The mayor peered at her over his spectacles. "Blasting? For what, Elara? A root cellar?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "For a dwelling," she said, her voice even. "A winterstead. There is a frost coming, a great one." She tried to explain the journals, the cycles, the signs. She spoke of the patterns her husband's family had documented for a century. Mayor Thompson held up a hand. He smiled a condescending, placating smile. "My dear woman, we all grieve. Elias was an odd man. You mustn't let his fancies consume you." "It is not fancy," she insisted. "It is history. It is observation." "It is nonsense," a sharp voice cut in. Dr. Finch had entered the office, his bag in hand. He was a man of science, a graduate of a distant and respected university. He believed in brick, in ventilation, in the modern principles of hygiene. "Living underground?" Dr. Finch scoffed, placing his bag on a chair. "That is a recipe for consumption, for dampness, for disease. We are civilized people, Elara. We live in the light and air." "The light and air will kill you when the temperature drops to 40 below and the snow is 20 feet deep," she stated. It was not a threat. It was a fact. The mayor's smile faded. His patience was gone. "That is enough. Your permit is noted, but I want no part of this folly. Prospect Creek is a modern town. We are building the Abernathy Grand Hotel, a testament to our future." He gestured out the window, toward the massive timber frame rising at the end of the main street. "We look forward, not backward, into some dusty, pessimistic book." Elara looked from the mayor's proud face to the doctor's dismissive sneer. She saw no understanding. She saw only the wall of their certainty. She nodded once, turned, and walked out. The story was all over town by noon. Elara, the poor, mad widow, was digging her own grave. The project was christened Elara's Folly. Mr. Abernathy, the wealthy builder of the new hotel, heard the story and laughed heartily. His hotel was a marvel of engineering, with vast panes of imported glass and a sprawling, unsupported roof over its grand ballroom. It was a structure of pride. "Let her dig," Abernathy was heard to say at the saloon. "When she's freezing in her dirt hole, we'll be drinking warm brandy in the finest hotel this side of the mountains." The mockery became a kind of sport. Children would sneak to the edge of her property to watch her work. They would shout names. "The Ice Widow! The Dirt Woman!" A new phrase entered the town's lexicon. To embark on a pointless, stubborn, fool's errand was to dig Elara's cellar. She heard the whispers when she went to the general store for blasting powder and salt. She saw the smirks. She felt the weight of their collective judgment. It did not stop her. The work began. It was a labor of brutal, methodical simplicity. The hill was granite and shale. She would drill into the rock by hand, turning the heavy star drill a quarter turn with each blow of the sledgehammer. The shock travelled up her arms, settling into her bones. Drill, turn, strike. Again and again. She would set the black powder charges herself, just as Elias had taught her. She learned to measure the force, to place the charges not for maximum explosion, but for controlled cracking, to break the rock into pieces she and Granite could manage. After each blast, a plume of dust would rise, and the real work would begin. Granite, the old horse, was her silent partner. He would stand patiently as she loaded the stone boat, a heavy wooden sledge with rubble. Then, on her command, he would lean into his harness, muscles straining, and drag the tons of shattered rock away from the growing cavern. They cleared the space, foot by agonizing foot. A chamber 30 feet wide and 50 feet deep, with a low, arched ceiling. The town saw her toil. They saw her, covered in dust, her face grim with effort, and they laughed. They saw a woman engaged in a meaningless, self-punishing ritual of grief. They did not see the calculations. They did not see her at night, by the light of a single lantern, studying the journals. She was calculating tonnage, shear strength, the angle of repose for the soil. She was designing a structure that would not resist the weight of the snow, but welcome it. A structure that would use the crushing burden of the storm as a perfect, insulating blanket. Summer came, hot and dry. The townspeople lounged on their porches. They spoke of the coming county fair and the grand opening of the Abernathy Hotel, scheduled for October. Elara did not rest. She and Granite hauled heavy timbers from the small woodlot at the back of her property. She notched them herself, fitting them into a massive frame that would support the entrance and the first 10 feet of the roof. Over the timbers, she laid 3 layers of heavy, tarred oilcloth, each layer overlapping the one below. It was waterproof, but its true purpose was to be a vapor barrier. Then came the earth. For weeks, she and Granite moved dirt. She used a heavy scoop, digging into the hillside above the cavern and piling the earth onto the roof of her dwelling. A foot, 2 feet, 5 feet of dense, packed soil. Finally, she laid sod over the entire mound. By August, grass was growing on the roof of her hidden home. From the valley below, it looked as if the hill had simply healed itself. The most crucial part was the ventilation. Dr. Finch had spoken of dampness, of stale air. he was not wrong. An unventilated underground space was a tomb. Elias's grandfather had designed the solution in 1823, a thermal siphon. Elara built 2 chimneys, or flues, both lined with smooth, round stones. The intake flue was low, near the floor, its opening nestled in a thicket of pines 100 yards down the slope. It would draw in the coldest, densest air. The exhaust flue was high, rising from the back of the main chamber straight up through 20 feet of rock and soil, its opening hidden on the crest of the hill. The warm, moist air from within the shelter, from her breath, from the small stove, from Granite's body heat, would naturally rise, pulling fresh, cold air in through the lower flue. It was a simple, powerless engine to keep the air moving, to keep it fresh and dry. While the town gossiped, Elara worked. She built shelves, hundreds of feet of them, lining the smooth stone walls of a smaller chamber at the rear of the dwelling. All through the late summer and early autumn, she harvested. She picked every wild apple, every berry. She dug buckets of wild onions and hardy roots. She traded the last of her husband's tools for sacks of flour, beans, and oats. Her hands were a constant blur of motion, slicing apples to be dried on racks near the stove, canning vegetables in scores of glass jars, salting meat in heavy stoneware crocks. The shelves filled. The town saw her buying sugar and salt in quantities they found absurd. It just added to the legend of her madness. By late September, the air began to change. There was a sharpness to it, a metallic tang that she recognized from the journals. She watched the squirrels. They were not gathering nuts. They were frantic, stripping the pines bare, their movements jerky and desperate. The last of the high-altitude birds were gone, weeks ahead of schedule. She checked the old brass barometer, a relic from the trunk. For the first time in 2 years, its needle began a slow, almost imperceptible, but undeniable, downward creep. The town was oblivious. The Abernathy Grand Hotel opened on October 15th. It was a magnificent party. Lights blazed from its enormous windows. A string quartet played in the ballroom. Mayor Thompson gave a speech praising Mr. Abernathy's vision and the town's unshakable march of progress. From her hill, Elara saw the glow of the hotel. It looked fragile. By the first week of November, the barometer's fall had steepened. The silence in the woods was now absolute. No birdsong, no insect hum. The air was thin and carried a strange weight. It was time. She spent 1 full day on her final preparations. She filled every barrel with water from her well. She stacked the last of the firewood inside the main chamber, a dense wall of seasoned oak and pine. She led Granite into his own spacious stall at the back of the cavern, a space she had designed for him. He entered without hesitation, as if he understood. She gave him a double ration of oats. On the evening of November 18th, she stood at the entrance to her winterstead. The sky was a strange, bruised purple. Not a breath of wind stirred. The lights of Prospect Creek twinkled below, a picture of blissful ignorance. A part of her, a small, human part, wanted to run down the hill, to scream at them, to force them to listen. But she remembered the mayor's patronizing smile. She remembered Dr. Finch's clinical disdain. She remembered the laughter. They had built their pride as high as Abernathy's hotel. It would have to fall on its own. She turned her back on the town. She swung the outer door shut. It was 3 layers of thick oak, insulated with wool. It fit into its stone jamb with a sigh of compressed air. She dropped the heavy crossbar into place. Then she closed the inner door, a smaller but equally robust barrier. The silence was no longer the silence of the forest. It was the silence of the deep earth, absolute and profound. She lit a single lantern. Its light cast a warm, steady glow on the stone walls, on the endless rows of preserved food, on the calm, munching form of her old horse. She was ready. The storm did not arrive on November 19th. It detonated. There was no prelude of rising wind, no gentle first flakes. At 3:17 in the morning, the world outside was struck a physical blow. Inside the winterstead, Elara felt it as a deep, subterranean vibration. The sound was not a whistle or a howl. It was a low, constant, grinding roar, the sound of a mountain being pulverized. It was the sound of the air itself turning into a solid, abrasive substance. She placed a hand on the cool stone wall. It was steady. The sound was a distant, muffled hum, a reminder of a world that no longer concerned her. Outside, it was chaos. The wind, moving at over 100 miles an hour, struck the Abernathy Grand Hotel. The vast, elegant roof, Mr. Abernathy's pride, held for less than a minute. The wind found a seam, lifted and peeled the entire structure away like a tin can lid. It vanished into the white fury. The magnificent plate glass windows, each costing a fortune, flexed once and then exploded inward, spraying the opulent lobby and ballroom with razor-sharp shards. Snow did not fall. It moved horizontally, a blinding, scouring wall of ice crystals. It poured into the ruined hotel, filling its grand spaces in minutes. The hotel, the symbol of Prospect Creek's future, became its most expensive tomb. Throughout the town, lesser destructions occurred. Roofs were stripped of their shingles. Windows on the windward side of every house were shattered. The snow, fine as sand, blasted its way through every crack and crevice. Families awoke to find snowdrifts forming inside their living rooms. They stuffed rags and blankets into the broken windows, but it was useless. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that had breached their walls. The telegraph lines had snapped in the first 5 minutes. The train tracks were buried under a 10-foot drift by dawn. Prospect Creek was cut off from the world. It was an island in a sea of white death. Days turned into a week. The storm did not abate. The snow accumulated with terrifying speed. The weight was immense. The roof of the general store was the first in town to go. It gave way with a great groan, burying the town's main supply of food under tons of snow and splintered timber. Other roofs began to sag, then fail. The sound of collapsing buildings became a regular punctuation to the endless roar of the wind. Inside her sanctuary, Elara lived by a quiet rhythm. The temperature held at a steady, comfortable 52 degrees. The air, drawn from the flue, was crisp and clean. She would wake, tend to Granite, and then make a simple hot breakfast on her small, efficient stove. She burned only 2 logs at a time. The heat reflected off the stone walls, creating a pocket of perfect warmth. She spent her days reading the journals, mending clothes, or simply listening to the deep, resonant silence of her shelter. The storm was an abstraction, a distant rumor. She had food for a year. She had water. She had warmth. She had safety. She had been right. After 3 weeks, the wind finally began to lose its impossible fury. After 4 weeks, it stopped. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise had been. Elara waited another 2 days, letting the new snow settle. Then, on December 21st, she prepared to open the door. It took her an hour. She had to heave against the crossbar. The weight of the snow against the outer door was immense. Finally, with a screech of wood on stone, It swung inward. She was met by a solid wall of white. The snow had buried her entrance completely, just as the journals had predicted. But she had planned for this. To the side of the door was a narrow, stone-lined tunnel, angled steeply upwards. It was a snow shaft, designed as a secondary exit. She climbed the rough stone steps, pushing against the packed snow at the top with a shovel. It gave way, and she emerged into a world she did not recognize. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The sun shone on a landscape of pure white. There were no trees visible, only mounds. No houses, only smooth, rolling dunes of snow. The valley was a uniform, 30-foot-deep blanket of white. The only feature breaking the surface was a thin plume of grey smoke, rising from her hidden exhaust flue on the crest of the hill. It was the only sign of life in the entire world. For 2 days, she saw nothing. She stayed close to her shelter, digging out a wider area around the entrance, creating a canyon with walls of snow. On the 3rd day, she saw movement. A figure, black against the white, stumbling and falling on the horizon. It was moving toward the only landmark available, her wisp of smoke. It took the figure hours to cover what would have been a few hundred yards. As it drew closer, she saw it was a man, wrapped in rags, his face black with frostbite. He collapsed 20 feet from her entrance. Elara walked out to him. She rolled him over. It was Dr. Finch. His eyes, sunk deep in his gaunt face, widened in disbelief. He tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Elara said nothing. She did not say, "You were wrong." She did not say, "I told you so." She hooked her arms under his, and with a strength born of a year of hard labor, she dragged him out of the snow and into the warmth of her winterstead. She sat him by the stove. She ladled a cup of warm broth and held it to his lips. He drank it with a desperate, animal need. He looked around the cavern. He saw the shelves of food. He saw the horse, calm and healthy. He saw the dry stone walls, the steady lantern light. He looked at the thermometer hanging by the door. 52 degrees. Tears streamed from his eyes, freezing on his frostbitten cheeks. "We were fools," he whispered, his voice raw. "Proud, arrogant fools." He told her everything. The destruction of the hotel, the collapsed roofs, the starvation, the freezing. He had survived by burning his furniture, his books, everything in his fireplace, until there was nothing left. Once he was stable, he knew what he had to do. He guided the first group back, his own wife and 2 children, along with the blacksmith's family. They arrived like ghosts, their faces masks of shock and suffering. They stared at Elara, the mad woman, the ice widow. They stared at her warm, safe, impossible home. Like the doctor, Elara greeted them with silence and broth. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, quiet sorrow. Wordlessly, she became their leader. She assigned spaces for each family. She rationed the food, providing 2 simple, hot meals a day. She organized the survivors, putting the able-bodied to work, digging a wider network of tunnels in the snow, searching for other survivors. A procession of the humbled began. Every day, more people arrived, guided by the smoke and the growing complex of snow canyons. They were the same people who had mocked her, who had laughed at her folly. Now they came to her door with their heads bowed, their pride frozen and shattered, begging for a space on her floor. She took them all in. The last to arrive were Mayor Thompson and Mr. Abernathy. They were barely alive. Abernathy, the wealthy builder, was a broken man. His fortune was buried under 30 feet of snow. His hands were wrapped in bloody rags. The frost had taken most of his fingers. Mayor Thompson, the portly, confident leader, was now a gaunt, hollow-eyed shell. He leaned on Abernathy, his body trembling with a constant, violent shudder. They stood before Elara in the warm, lantern-lit cavern, surrounded by the faces of the 54 souls she had already saved. The mayor tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but shame was a physical thing, choking him. He fell to his knees. We were wrong, he finally managed, his voice a broken sob. You were right. Elara looked down at the man who had called her mad. She looked at the builder who had laughed at her. She saw not antagonists, but merely men, stripped of everything but their own profound failure. She nodded to Dr. Finch. Help them find a place by the fire. For 6 more weeks, the town of Prospect Creek existed entirely within the walls of Elara's winterstead. She taught them the rhythms of her shelter, the conservation of heat, the rationing of food, the importance of shared work. The Ice Widow had become their Noah. Her folly had become their ark. When the great thaw finally came in late February, a town meeting was held. Not in the ruined town hall, but in the main chamber of the winterstead, the place of their salvation. Mayor Thompson stood before his people. Beside him stood Dr. Finch and Mr. Abernathy. I have no right to be your mayor, Thompson began, his voice clear and steady for the first time in months. My pride, our pride, nearly destroyed us all. He turned to face Elara, who stood quietly at the back, near Granite's stall. We mocked you, he said, his voice ringing against the stone. We called your wisdom madness. We laughed at your labor while we celebrated our own vanity. We were wrong. You were right. You, and the knowledge you so carefully preserved, saved every last one of us. There are no words to properly apologize, but I will say them. We are sorry, Elara. We were fools. Dr. Finch stepped forward. My science was blind. I saw only textbooks, not the truth of the world. Your home, this unhealthy place, is the healthiest place I have ever been. You built for reality, not for theory. I was wrong. Mr. Abernathy, his hands bandaged, was last. I built with pride and glass, he said, his voice hoarse. It was worthless. You built with stone and humility. It was priceless. You were right. I was wrong. Elara stepped forward into the light. The faces of the townspeople were turned to her, filled with a reverence that was almost painful to behold. There is no blame left, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the stillness. Blame is a luxury. Survival is about preparation. It is about listening to the world instead of to our own pride. What you called my folly was simply a lesson learned by my husband's family long ago. Now, you have all learned it too. She looked at their faces. We will rebuild, but we will rebuild with wisdom. And they did. The new town of Prospect Creek looked nothing like the old one. The houses were built lower to the ground, many of them partially sheltered by the earth. Roofs were steeply pitched and heavily reinforced. Windows were smaller, shuttered, and placed to avoid the prevailing winter winds. Every single home had a deep, well-stocked cellar, built to the principles Elara taught them. The derogatory phrase, to dig Elara's cellar, was reborn. It came to mean an act of profound foresight, of preparing with quiet wisdom against a disaster others refuse to see. It was the highest compliment one could pay a neighbour. Elara never moved back into the town. Her home was the winterstead. It was her sanctuary, and now it was the heart of the community's memory. She never remarried. She did not seek a family or a conventional life. Her solitude was not one of loneliness, but of purpose. She lived for another 43 years, becoming a quiet, revered sage. They called her the Mother of the Valley. Generations of children grew up making pilgrimages to her home.
She taught them how to read the clouds, how to understand the behavior of the animals, how to listen to the silence of the woods. She showed them the journals, her hands tracing the faded ink of the first warnings. She died peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer evening at the age of 88, within the stone walls that had saved a town. They buried her on the green, sodded roof of her home, a place where she could forever be part of the hill that had protected them all. The winterstead was never allowed to fall into disrepair. It was maintained by the town as a sacred monument, a permanent lesson in humility. Over the heavy oak door, they placed a simple bronze plaque. It did not bear a long epitaph. It said only, "Elara's folly." She was right.